Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Angie, and for this video I've got a few more easy to make Christmas crafts. Okay, for this project, if you have these spun cotton balls, I would suggest you use those, but this is the only size I have, and obviously it's not big enough. So I'm going to use these styrofoam balls, and I've got this really thin felt from Dollar Tree. I just did a coffee dye on it, and then I'm going to stretch it over the styrofoam balls. I started by giving the styrofoam ball a coat of regular white glue. I then put the felt on and tried to minimize the amount of wrinkles and tucks. Once I had the felt over the entire ball, I tied a piece of string around the bottom. I did the same thing for both of the balls. Next, I glued a toothpick into the larger ball on the smooth side and then glued the smaller ball again on the smooth side onto the toothpick. You'll end up with the gathered ends on the top and bottom of the snowman. I then set it aside to dry. Next, I used a peat pot and gave it a quick coat of black paint. Once the paint was dry, I covered it with some watered down white glue and then sprinkled it with cinnamon. When that was dry, I added a coat of the watered down white glue over the cinnamon to seal it. Next, I used a scrap of black felt to make a hat. I started by cutting a circle for the brim. I then cut a rectangle and sewed down the side, and then sewed a small circle of felt for the top, turning it right side out when I was done. I then cut a small circle out of the middle of the brim and sewed the hat to this brim. Next, I used a paper cutter and cut some thin strips of craft paper and book pages. When the snowman was dry, I trimmed off the excess fabric at the top and bottom.
To add weight to the pot, I glued in a few small wood slices. This will also let the snowman sit higher in the pot and have something I can glue onto. Next, I glued the hat onto his head. For the arms, I just used some small sticks from my yard. To make the nose, I whittled down a small stick into more of a carrot shape and then painted it orange. To attach the arms, I poked a small hole into the side and then hot glued it into place. I did the same for the nose. To make the eyes, I glued on a couple of peppercorns. I used blush to color the cheeks. I also used peppercorns for the buttons. To make the mouth, I used a small piece of rusty wire that I bent into a smile and then poked the ends into the ball, adding a little dot of glue as well. I added a little bit of black paint to the eyes to make them darker. Next, I strung some letters onto a piece of rusty wire. I then added a thin piece of felt for the scarf. I used some chenille stems for the candy cane. I didn't know which one I wanted to use, so one was a red and white stripe, and for the other I glued a piece of red twine around a fluffy white stem. I then coffee stained both of them and let them dry. I decided I'd like the one with the twine added, so I used that one. Next, I glued some of the paper shreds to the inside of the peat pots. I then glued in the snowman and some small bits of greenery. Next, I poked a small hole on each side and added the rusty wire. To finish it, I glued on the candy cane and a few more small bits of greenery. For the next project, I'm using an empty ribbon roll. I started by cutting the edges flush with the middle. I then cut out a circle of scrapbook paper that's a little larger than the ribbon roll and glued it onto each end. I then cut small slits around the paper and folded and glued those over the edge. Once I had both ends covered, I cut a piece of scrapbook paper to cover the side of the roll. I then just used a glue stick and glued the paper on. Next, I made small ropes out of air dry clay to go around the top and bottom rim. You don't have to use the clay. You can use trim if you want. I added 2 rows of the clay rope on the top and bottom and then set it aside to dry. To make the string for the sides, I used metallic embroidery floss that I stiffened by dipping it into watered down white glue and then letting it dry. I used Fabri-Tac to attach it to the sides. Next, I made some clay holly leaves and glued those at the top and bottom of the string. To make the drumsticks, I rolled out a small ball of clay and glued it to a toothpick. When the clay was dry, I decoupaged an image to both sides of the drum and let that dry. Next, I painted all the clay elements black and then highlighted them with gold rub and buff. I then used a 2-step crackle over the image. I put on step 1, let that dry, and then put on step 2. While the crackle was drying, I gave the drumsticks a coat of paint. When the crackle was dry, I added some antique paste to highlight the crackle. To make the hanger, I started with a bead cap that I flattened with a hammer. I glued that on and then made a small hole and added an eye hook along with a little glue. Next, I wired the drumsticks together and then attached them to the top of the drum. I also added a few small bits of greenery and a few beads from a miniature garland. Since you could see where I cut the string on these beads, I used a little bit of paint to cover it. To finish it, I added a ribbon hanger. For the last project, I'm starting with a wooden ornament blank. I removed the twine hanger and glued on some leftover resin pieces to the top and bottom. Next, I used hot glue and made a squiggly oval shape in the middle. I then gave it a coat of paint. Next, I used a metallic paint and painted all the resin pieces and the glue. I then used a sponge brush to add some texture to the back and outer front of the ornament. I decided to add a snowflake to the back, so I painted that and then glued it into place. For the center of the ornament, I decoupaged a small image onto it. I also decided to add the metallic paint to the edge. I used the two-step crackle over this image as well. Next, I drilled a small hole in the top and bottom resin piece. Since I didn't have a jump ring big enough, I just made a loop of wire and put this through the holes. I then added some Stickles glitter glue around the edges of the front and back and also around the image. I also used it on the negative spaces. Next, I added some gold rub and buff over the resin pieces to give the metallic paint a golden highlight. I also used some antiquing wax to tone down the bright white paint.
This here, it's just clear wax, with just a tiny bit of the antiquing wax mixed in.
I then added a ribbon hanger and a bow. To finish it, I used the gold embroidery floss to make a small tassel and added that to the bottom. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed these projects, and I'll see you in the next video.